And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mica Andrews. Mica L. Andrews is a professional. I'm sorry, Anders, not Andrews.
That's
Oh my
okay.
goodness. I'm so sorry about that.
No
My brain
worries.
just went into automatic mode. Okay, so let me start over. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker Mica Anders. Mica L. Anders is a professional genealogist specializing in African American genealogy with almost 20 years of experience. As the first ever history fellow at the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum, she conducted pioneering research on early African American communities, earning the Minnesota Genealogical Society's Pioneer Award for her work. With expertise in navigating pre-1870 research challenges, Micah combines rigorous historical research with storytelling to bring ancestors' stories to life. She also collaborates with museums to highlight underrepresented narratives and is a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists. So now, without further ado, I will pass the mic over to Micah to begin her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. Wow, we have 92 participants right now in the room. So thank you all for spending your either evening, afternoon, wherever you are, time zone wise, with us to talk about anti-racist genealogy. So the official title for this is Anti-Racist Genealogy Through a European American Lens. I am half European American, half African American. When this presentation was originally designed, it was actually a librarian named Chip Gehring. They and I worked together to do the original version. And since then, they have given me permission to be able to present it on my own. But I always want to make sure to give credit to them for some of the original conceptions of this presentation. So today we're going to try and cover a lot in a little bit of time. And really, we're going to talk about differences in approach to genealogy, differences in access, what's missing, what's not missing, what's available. We'll talk super briefly. I took some of it out just for time on DNA testing. And really, the last portion of this, and it's really my favorite portion, is about paying it forward. For me to just give this talk and say, this is what it is, but not talk about what we can do differently would be really doing a disservice to all of you who have come to learn about this topic today. So it's really important that we don't just talk about, here are some problems, but also here are some things we can do about it. We are not going to do a basic genealogy. I'm not going to talk about how to start a family tree or, genealogy 101. I'm not going to really define racism, white privilege, or bias. If those are things you don't have a basic understanding in yet, there's some really great readings on white privilege, the tenets of white supremacy culture. I would highly recommend doing some readings on those things. And as well, I'm not going to go into DNA testing tutorials. So just kind of get a sense of what we're not going to cover. Again, we have about an hour, so we can only do so much. But I do want to talk about what is genealogy. So when I think about genealogy, it's really important to understand that we use the term a couple different ways. So there's genealogy, there's family history. We often use them interchangeably, but really genealogy itself is really about names, dates, places. Not necessarily sort of the social side of our family history, not always those really cool stories about who lived where when in terms of like who they interacted with, but it's really names, dates, places. When we add family history into the mix, that's when we really start with the stories and the sort of the social scene of the time and things like that. So I use the word genealogy interchangeably with family history, but technically it isn't exactly the same thing. I'm also not going to go too deep into what is whiteness, but I do think we need sort of a sense of it. It really is a social construct, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who have come here from other countries who, when they came to the United States, became part of white culture, even if they might not have started that way. We think about like the Irish and the Italians, who originally were definitely not considered part of white culture, integrated in. A lot of other ethnic groups have done the same. So whiteness really is a social construct, but it's important to name it, it's important to identify it, and it's important to see it. When we do genealogy, there's a few different approaches to how folks do their research. A lot of the traditional methods for genealogy are really based in a European American tradition for genealogical research. research. The goal is often, let's get back to Europe. People talk about, I want to know who's from the old country. I want to know who came to Ellis Island, who had their name changed, which they didn't at Ellis Island. That didn't happen, but that's a different story. It didn't happen often. But, right, it's about who is famous. Who do I descend from Charlemagne? Am I related to a king somewhere? And there's this general assumption that if we do our good genealogy, we should be able to get back somewhere to the 1700s. The record should exist. There should be some sort of paper trail, family history. Somebody's probably written something down over time. And if we know what we're doing, it's pretty easy to get back to the 1700s, just some work, right? So that's kind of this Eurocentric lens through which people think about genealogy. For a lot of African Americans, rather than the goal always being to get to the old country, because we don't really even necessarily know what country that is. Maybe we have a continent, but not necessarily a country. The goal really is to get back to enslavement, to try and find at least, if not further back, the last generation of our family who was enslaved. And not only do we want to know who was enslaved, we want to usually figure out who their enslaver was. That often feels like it's really starting to fill a void, right? Because so much history was taken and lost. So there's this idea that if people can get back to like the 1870s, 1860s, then they feel like they've really completed or have a really good filled family history. So that's really different, right? 1700s versus maybe 1870s. That's a very different idea of what success can look like. And I think another thing for both African Americans and a lot of sort of non-European or non-Christian groups is really about how family fit into society. It's really about, struggles, oppression, systems that happened during history that impacted our families and how we got to where we are today. So again, these are all generalizations. So I'm going to say that on the front end, right? The point of this presentation isn't to be like, this is the only way this happens, and this is the only way this happens. But it's really more about looking at some compare and contrast and frequency of different things and just really understanding these different ways of being and different ways genealogy works and working through that together. So I have this really funny thing that we're not going to watch because Keynote doesn't want to play nice with YouTube right now. However, if you get a chance, there is an episode of Key and Peele where they do a mock ad for Ancestry.com. And it's all these people, mostly white people, saying, I did my research and I descend from Thomas Jefferson. And then it's these black folks who start coming in and saying, I did my research and I descend from Thomas Jefferson. I'm not Key or Peele. I'm not so funny, but it's very funny. And if you have a moment to YouTube it, I would do that because we're not going to be able to watch it today because it's about to skip right past it. There was no play button showing up. We tried in the interim before we started, and it just tried to make me go onto YouTube. So as we talk about ancestry, I think it's really important to think about how are they advertising their services? How are they advertising what they do and what they think people want? And this really goes back to how people use genealogy that I just talked about a few minutes ago. Oftentimes, it's considered something about discover your family heroes, right? Who was important? Who was famous? Or they say things like, find ancestors worthy of a status update. This one's a little older. We don't really talk about status updates anymore. This is sort of a mock Facebook ad. But it's this idea, like I talked about earlier, where we want to find the important people in our family. And often, again, that's often a more Eurocentric style of genealogy. There's this idea that we have people in our family who may have been famous, who may have been important, who may have done something noteworthy, and we want to find them. This is from Family Search. This was in Chip's family. They had this pop up on their family search while they were researching, and I left it in here even though they're not here. They said I could, just to talk about this idea of congratulations, it said, we found one of your ancestors. Jacob Amazon Phillips was a young pioneer, right? So it's this language that's talking about the pioneers and going out into the West and, conquering the land. And all of this language really discounts the fact that none of this land was actually available. It discounts a lot of what happened with the native people who were already in this land and the interactions that a lot of the European Americans who were coming across the plains, for example, um, what interactions they had with the native people. When we add words like brave pioneer, there's a lot of other connotations that can happen with those words because they have a lot of language underneath them that's really about conquering land, conquering a people in order to become said brave pioneers. So in my family, on my mom's side, we have folks who settled in Nebraska. They were homesteaders. There's some family letters that I found from my grandma's family where they talk about their interactions with the native people who lived there. They don't ever really name who the tribes are. Most of those interactions are somewhat unpleasant. It talks about them conquering the native people who lived there in order to take the land. And I think, a lot of times, a lot of families, a lot of European families have these stories, right? Especially if you came across the country. And I think it's really important to reframe them. And I'll talk about this in a little bit when I talk about the Homestead Act. But when we see things like this, just remember that this story is a piece of a story. And when we remove all of the other parts, when we remove the native population who was already on this land, and when we make this Jacob Amazon Phillips a hero, it's really kind of playing into some kind of odd things. This was a child. It's also odd because it's a picture of a little girl, but they're talking about a boy, but that's just my art background kind of kicking in. But we talk about his storage of courage and faith. We just have to really reframe this. Can he just be a boy? Can he just be a person who had these experiences? Why do we have to turn it into this heroism? Just keep that in mind. On the other side, what I've started to observe when ancestry, family search companies like this do promote their more ethnic resources, they don't talk about heroes very often. They don't talk about making your way back to kings or noble people. Often when they do advertisements targeted more towards people who are not European or not European dominant, it does come back to this place of story of who are you, find yourself. But in a way, that's almost assuming that if you're not European, you don't know who you are. You don't have your family history. And that's really not always true either. The fact this young boy is holding this photo of probably either a grandparent or a great grandparent means he already does have a sense of who he is and where he comes from. So to use language that kind of assumes that you don't have that is almost just as bad as using language to suggest everybody could have been a king or a noble person. So this language really matters, and just understanding, thinking about in ourselves, why are we doing our genealogy? Is it to understand where we come from? I think for a lot of us it is, but how is that talked about in a way that's not assuming we don't already know something? Or how do we talk about finding our ancestors without hoping everybody was a king or a conqueror or a hero in some ways? So I don't know who remembers this. A few years back, Ben Affleck was invited to be on the show Finding Your Roots on PBS. And they did the work. They found out he descended from enslavers, which is incredibly common for families who have been in the United States a long time. His family's from the East Coast. He's kind of a Boston guy. That's what at least he was in some of his early movies. And there's just this idea of, okay, I don't want to know that history, or that's not my history. That doesn't align with my hero stories. That doesn't align with these ways of being and how I want to perceive myself. So I think it's just really important that when we do this work, when we think about our genealogy, when we think about helping people, right? Because I know there's other people on here who are professional genealogists or hobbyists who help others. How do we make sure that we're not inflating history, right? Everybody's not a hero when they're 5, but also we're not hiding history, right? So whether you descend from enslavers, whether you descend from enslaved, whether you descend from people who were poor, people who were rich, all of those stories are valid and important to be told. And so what happened here, for those who don't know, was they found out on Finding Your Roots, the researchers found out that Ben Affleck had some ancestors, like I said, who were enslavers. And he asked the show to suppress that information. He got some serious backlash from that. And the quote that I read after he did the episode, and eventually that information was shared, was in fact that he was glad that he did learn that information and he was able to have some context around it. and not just like it says, be a guy who had family members who owned enslaved people. So I'm going to talk more about what that looks like in a little bit, but just really think about why we're doing our work and what it means to tell a whole history and understand our ancestors come from a variety of backgrounds, and none of them are bad per se, but we just need to know how to contextualize that information. So, and again, this is like an abridged version. I want to make sure we fit it in time so I have time for questions. So, now we've kind of given a little bit of background, it's important to talk about another part of why this matters. When you're doing your research, if you're primarily looking for European American records, either here in the United States or across the pond in Europe, mostly when I talk about Europe, I mean Western Europe. Eastern Europe doesn't quite fit some of these models. They have some more complicated history as well as more complicated record groups, but Western Europe in general is a bit easier to research. But there's a lot of differences. So traditionally, white people leave a longer paper trail. More people here in the US who are European American, they had property. More people had property. More people were familiar with the legal system. So they may have wills, they may have had good probate files, they may have had more paper records, letters, journals, diaries, things that are just more of a written paper trail. They were documented as full humans for more time traditionally, right? So enslaved people, for example, were not all enslaved people were not documented as full humans. They were documented as property for such a long time that they don't have the same type of paper trail, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But when you start to think about things like white privilege plays a huge role in why European American descendants have such a longer paper trail. So imagine you had a family member who was a homesteader. They got land. They were able to take that land, accumulate more land, transfer that land. That land may still be in the family to this day. Now, that's not to say people who were not European American did not own land, did not homestead. It's more of a numbers situation, right? It also goes with educational records. When you have a population or multiple populations who are struggling with English, who were asked, in the case of African Americans, they were not allowed to learn to read and write. We have a shorter history of educational records. We have a shorter history of written documents to cover those ancestors. So when we get things like these shaky leaves on Ancestry, or sort of the hints they have on Family Search, oftentimes, if you are European American or if part of your family is European American, you will just see record after record after record. And again, I'm generalizing because sometimes it does still dead end, right? But the availability of records, the records that have been digitized, the records that are available online, the records that were deemed important and early to be scanned, to be transcribed, they're often following European American families, excuse me. But sometimes something interesting can happen. So, in addition to the records that they show us on the shaky leaf hints, all of these sites have other records that may be digitized, may have been transcribed, may be indexed, but they don't necessarily pop up on the hints. And sometimes this is because of some of these things we're talking about, this white privilege, this sort of this Ben Affleck scenario of I don't want to know my ancestors were enslavers. So this is an example from an 1860 census from Fayette County, Kentucky. This is a census for a man named Henry Bowman and his family. Now, you'll notice that Henry's occupation is listed as farming, not farmer. Often, if you have ancestors who are in the South, in this 1860 or 1850 census, and you run into something where you see really high real estate values and or really high personal estate values, when they are clearly in sort of an agrarian profession, but may not actually be farmers, it's really important that you pause and reflect on how did they get that money living in this part of the country in what would have been a very slave economy based system. Taking that step back, Ancestry doesn't always show this to you on a shaky leaf hint. So sometimes you have to go in and actually do a specific search. So in this case, I saw Henry Bowman. I saw all of that real estate, all of that personal estate, the fact he was farming and not a farmer. And that to me was a giant light bulb that said, you need to see if he has a slave schedule. So the slave schedule, again, 1850 and 1860 are the two that are available on Ancestry. I believe they're on Family Search, but please don't quote me on that. But here's what's important about the slave schedule. The slave schedules were made to document the people who were living on the property or working the day the census taker came, and document them by age, gender, and color. Now, some in this case are listed as Black, some are listed as mulatto. Some people, when they look at this, they're like, oh my gosh, all the mulatto people, and again, we don't use this term anymore. I'm just using it because it's on the records. All the mulatto people must have a white ancestor. Oh my gosh, all of them are the descendant of the enslaver. Maybe. They could be. But it could also be that they're just more fair complected. And this is the case both on the slave schedules and in the regular census. Somebody went, they either looked at everybody, they said, you're a little darker, a little lighter, we're going to call you Black, we're going to call you mulatto. But please note that what's missing here are names. There's no names. So the only name listed at the very top is Henry Bowman. And under that, it just says it's HB continued. So that's what it says on that second set of information. The only person named is the enslaver because he's the only person who wasn't considered property. The slave schedule is the same as another agricultural schedule. This is a list of his property. So this is an opportunity that people have that if they find their own ancestors listed on a slave schedule as an enslaver, I'll use the word great, probably not the right word. It's a great opportunity to really get a better sense of how that ancestor accumulated his wealth, who the people may have been who were enslaved and were actually making that money on his behalf through their forced labor. A lot of people shy away from doing this part of the research, right? Kind of like Ben Affleck was saying. I just want to know 1860, Henry Bowman had a lot of money, a lot of land. That's cool. I don't necessarily want to know sort of that dark side, but it's important. It's really important to know it. It's important to acknowledge it and identify it. And at the end, I'll talk about how we can kind of pay it forward. But part of genealogy is, right, we leave no stone unturned. So we have to learn this history. We have to sit in it. And we have to acknowledge that this was 1860. Henry Bowman had children. They had children. If one of us descends from Henry Bowman, we have benefited from the legacy of enslavement. We have benefited from the economy of enslavement. And we may be in a social standing now that is what it is because of what happened in 1860. And when we write our family narratives, when we make our family trees, I don't believe, and this is my personal opinion, I don't believe we should be leaving these things out because in order to understand how we got where we are, we have to understand some of the systems that played out that got us here. And like I talked about earlier, another of those systems was the Homestead Act, right? This idea that millions of acres of land were just free and available to people. A lot of our ancestors, mine included, benefited from the Homestead Act. Anybody who came across to the Midwest and they got land, they squatted on that land for a certain amount of time, then they got to claim it, quote unquote, as their own. This distribution of quote unquote public land, what it says on here, right? 80 million acres. 80 million acres of land that belonged to people already. It's hard because in a lot of the native nations, they would never have said they owned land. So it's even more complicated to say it was their land and now it's somebody else's land because to them, you don't necessarily own land. But, you know, we really have to think about things like this. When we read ads like this for Nebraska, land for the landless, homes for the homeless, we have to read those from two sides. The irony that we are now making another group of people landless, We are making another group of people homeless or moving them to a reservation and rehoming them while using language to talk again about those brave pioneers, right? That bravery language again, that hero language is being used. And and as genealogists, we really have to have a critical eye when we look at things like this and really understand that it's not just for face value. Going to kind of switch topics here and talk a little bit about some other places this disparity and this difference shows up. So this I call the tale of two cemeteries. There are two cemeteries in Missouri, Pettis County, Missouri, named Dresden Cemetery. One's called Dresden Cemetery. One's sometimes called Dresden Black Cemetery. Sometimes it's just called Dresden North Cemetery. This is where my family is buried, is there in Dresden Black Cemetery. Just looking at the entrance to the cemeteries, you'll notice one is clearly well cared for, has a giant archway. The other has a sign with nothing on the top, a little sign underneath, and in really little letters on that third sign down. If I remember correctly, it basically says that the caretakers of this cemetery are the Lincoln Hubbard Alumni Association. Lincoln Hubbard was the all-Black high school, which doesn't even exist anymore, in that area. It's the school my dad went to, his siblings all went to as well. So rather than the town, the city, somebody being in charge of the Black cemetery, it's on the alumni of a school which doesn't exist. And my father has passed. Actually, today's his birthday, but my father has passed. He was one of the last ones still alive from his school. So now who's in charge of this cemetery? And not only who's in charge of it, is it even documented? I went on Google Maps to find it. It's not even on there. It doesn't have a pin drop. Dresden Cemetery has a pin drop. But if I wanted to go to Dresden Black Cemetery to go see my grandma or my great grandparents or my other family members who are buried here, Google's not going to take me there. You have to keep that stuff in mind. Sometimes the thought is almost a place of gratitude, like, man, I'm just so grateful that I was able to go find Dresden Cemetery and I was able to walk right under the iron archway and I was able to find my relatives. Sometimes just taking that moment to understand that for whatever reason, historical reasons, one cemetery is larger, one is smaller. The fact they're already segregated says a lot about this area, and even how they look. A lot of the headstones in Dresden Black Cemetery were hand carved. You can actually see somebody went in and carved them in scratchy handwriting rather than, this beautiful engraved writing. A lot of them are gone. A lot of people never had headstones. And again, I'm generalizing, right? Because on my white side, I also have people who do not have headstones. But when we talk about numbers, we talk about percentages, the percentages are just very, very different. So this is just something to keep in mind. And we'll talk about this at the end. We talk about ways to pay it forward, right? Another thing to think about is how other cemeteries were treated and the perceived value of those cemeteries. A lot of Black cemeteries don't even have a little wooden sign that says Alumni Association cares for this cemetery. A lot of them have highways over top of them. They have schools built over them. They have other monuments, highways running through them. This is an example from here in St. Paul of a native burial ground. And they buried a lot of their ancestors and their relatives when they passed away in mounds. And later, when the European Americans came, they saw these as a park. So this is actually considered a park. To this day, this is a park. And there's now in 2025 a fence this tall, maybe 6 to 8 inches, around what's left of the mound, which obviously doesn't deter anybody from crossing it, climbing on it, doing their own little digs into it. And so we just have to think about, right, some of our cemeteries, on my mom's side, we have a beautiful family cemetery where people from all over the town are buried. It's well preserved. It's attached to a church. The church is still in existence. All the records are still inside the church. I can go in and take pictures of them. They're not digitized, but those books are all well preserved and in that church. On the other side, right, there's not a lot of records in written form to tell us about the people who may have been buried here in these mounds, or even the folks in the cemetery in Dresden. I was just showing you where my family are. And a lot of that comes from different traditions, right? We have so many different ways we keep records. And a lot of the priority has been placed on written records, European records, And now there's starting to be some change. More quote unquote ethnic newspapers are starting to get digitized. But the first ones that seem to have gotten digitized were the Swedish newspapers, the Norwegian newspapers, uh, to an extent, some of the Hebrew newspapers, not as often though. They weren't necessarily in that first round. They're starting to do more of the Spanish language newspapers or even some of the different, I think we have a Hmong newspaper here, for example. But as those are just now being digitized, we're just getting access. If you don't live in the place that newspaper exists and where your ancestors lived, we're just getting access to those records. We're just getting access to that great gossipy newspaper information that has been so instrumental in helping so many of us move our family histories back. So, again, some of this is really just to think about what it looks like when certain groups are prioritized and their stuff gets digitized, their stuff is accessible, and how that perpetuates this imbalance between how far back somebody can trace their family. Why saying we can get to the 1700s is not as much of a stretch when there's so much more digitized, so much more available. The other thing that's starting to be more recognized is oral history traditions, right? This is an example here of a Hmong story quilt. They their tradition often was to embroider their histories into these story quilts, and they had people who knew how to read them, and this told the story of a group of people. A lot of African and African American families have griots, both of the community or of the town, or even just of the family, and they pass those stories forward. However, and still, a lot of this gets swept under the rug as ethnic folklore, right? Oh, it wasn't written down, so it's not true. But as this is a room of people who often have done genealogy, we all are quite aware that just because something's written down does not mean that it was true, right? So, this idea that the written word is valued more or higher than things that are from an oral tradition is just kind of silly because both of them have truth and both of them have um, fabricated truths, exaggerated truths, sometimes flat out lies, right? So it's important to think about one is not superior to the other. They come from different traditions and different cultures. So it's important to keep that in mind. Not only are there these sort of subtle differences, there are some really glaring things where genealogy was specifically used to promote racist agendas. Blood quantum is one example, right? That would be the idea that, oh, if you're not a certain percentage native, you no longer get to quote unquote qualify for tribal affiliation. Um, Another thing that happens is the United States Census itself. So each census year decided the people who created the census each year, they would decide what the racial categories were. This is only a couple pages, but this timeline on the Pew Social Trends is fascinating, and I highly recommend you take some time to look at it. It's just really, really interesting. They have a slide for every single census and talk about what the different categories were for each, right? So this would be 1790 compared to 2010, which was at the time the latest census when they did this. Obviously, now we have 2020. There's way more options in some senses, but in other senses, there's still a lot missing. But this, for example, was a comparative to 1880. Oh, here we go. This is just a longer screenshot. Okay. So this is 1880. In 1880, they had white, and white people were just white. There wasn't a breakdown of German, Swiss, Irish. It was just once you've come to the United States, and that's why I talked about the assumption of whiteness at the beginning. You are now just white. There's no breakdown. Yet on the Asian side, which is the green boxes, in 1880, if you were Asian, you were categorized as Chinese. Whether you were Chinese ethnically or not, the only option to categorize anybody who was Asian, excuse me, was Chinese. In contrast to 2010, they have a few more options as well as an other option. As somebody who's lived my whole life in an other box, I think all of these categories are a little bit funny, but I get why they're doing it. So keep in mind that even in the census, there was an agenda, there was a plan. People were categorized to represent certain things. People were left out as well. Um, Here is the 2020. You'll see they have a couple more categories, even in the Asian category. African American category, they have two options. And they actually have an other box in 2020, which they don't have in a lot of the censuses. So in 2020, 1920. So in 1920, they at least acknowledge that not everybody is going to fit in one of these very specific categories. So, in addition to just how people were categorized, there's a lot of organizations that had really clear missions that were tied to genealogy and were really tied to white blood, if you will, right? Caucasian blood in this case. So, DAR for a long time had a purity clause. And in order to be a part of the organization, this has since changed, but at that time, in order to be a part of the organization, you really had to be able to, you could only be a white person. That was part of their ideals, that was part of their mission, and that was part of why they existed. This really folds into the start of genealogy. National Geneal National the National Genealogical Society, NGS, was founded by multiple people, but one of the people who helped found it was Dr. Plecker, to my knowledge, and he was a huge proponent of the eugenics movement. And it was very important to him to designate and classify everybody and be able to trace your bloodline to make sure there was not a single drop of quote unquote Negro blood in your bloodline. The irony of all this with DNA testing is a lot of people who didn't think they had any quote unquote Negro blood have found that that is in fact not really the case. So in, I believe it was 2020, I'm going to get the date wrong, the NGS, National Genealogical Society, actually issued a statement to very clearly separate themselves from some of these early foundings of their organization. But that's a long time after they started. And it was a long time before African Americans were even allowed to be part of NGS. So even these organizations that are still around today have changed their policies, right? DAR has changed their policies, NGS has changed their policies, but these are organizations who were founded in exclusion. They were founded in whiteness, founded in principles of sort of this white supremacy characteristics. So when we join organizations, when we really get deep into this field, it's important to understand that part of why the field of genealogy exists as it exists today, and part of why certain records are more accessible than others, is specifically because part of the original missions were really about whiteness and white purity. On that, I want to make sure we touch briefly on boarding schools and also on blood quantum. I talked a little about blood quantum with that little cartoon, if you will, earlier, but the same concepts of not wanting any Negro blood were this sort of the opposite, but this other, I would say, what is the phrase? The other side of the same coin, right? Of trying to lower the blood quantum, and that's not really a term we use anymore, so I just want to put that out there. Lower the blood quantum of people who were Native. It was to really make them seem more European, bring them closer to whiteness, take away the parts of them that were really tied to their culture and to assimilate them and make them quote unquote proper. This is really important when we talk about land, when we talk about buildings. Here in Minnesota, one of our universities used to actually be a Native boarding school. And they've actually done a pretty good job with their reparations. And now if you are Native, you can attend that school for free. I think there could be some difficulties with that from a perception of ancestors and ghosts. For me personally, I think that would weird me out to go to a school where my ancestors were basically jailed, but that's their way of trying to do that reparations work. So again, we have to think about whose land are we on, whose buildings are we in, why were these buildings originally designed, and what are we doing with that knowledge, right? Because we have to learn it, but we have to figure out what are we doing with that knowledge. And so that's what Pay It Forward is all about. So a lot of this is about descendants of the enslaved, but these things work in a lot of different ways. So I like to start with this quote, and that is, Without records of births or deaths, marriages or baptism, slaves were an invisible presence easily forgotten. So, again, these records, these paper trails, these are the things that really help us trace our family history, be able to get back further than 1870 on the African American lines, be able to get deeper into those records. For example, like I showed earlier on that census schedule, all of those people who were listed as the enslaved people of Henry Bowman, there's no name. In a sense, they are literally invisible. They are a gender, they are a race, they are an age, all of which are somewhat approximate. Well, the gender, not fully, but yes. So it's important to think about who's holding the records. So if you are somebody who descends from enslavers or descends from people who have a stronger paper trail, it's worth it to look in your records and see what you have that could benefit the descendants of the people who your family may have enslaved. We'll get to that in a minute. Another way to pay it forward is to do things like be a Find a Grave volunteer. I'm going to give a couple different volunteer opportunities. So Find a Grave, a lot of us use it all the time. Somebody has gone to that Dresden cemetery where my family is buried, the Dresden North, Dresden Black Cemetery, and they have done a good job of documenting the stones that still exist. Unfortunately, most of the people there have no stones, so they aren't documented in Find a Grave. But when we think about this, a lot of times people say, I'll just go to the cemetery where my ancestors are. And that's great. But when we think about paying it forward and that discrepancy between the Dresden Cemetery, which really is the Dresden White Cemetery, and the Black Dresden Cemetery, taking the time to go to some of the smaller cemeteries, the ethnic cemeteries. If, for example, you know your family was a family of enslavers and you know there's a family cemetery, there may be enslaved people who were buried there. It may be documented in papers, family papers. It may be documented with actual headstones. Those things probably aren't on Find a Grave, but you can contribute to Find a Grave and make sure they get added so that those descendants of the enslaved people have an opportunity to advance their genealogy work and move their family stories forward, backwards as well. Another opportunity is to join an organization like Coming to the Table. Coming to the Table is a national organization. They have local chapters. You can find them when you go to participate and find your local group. I know we have one here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul area. They're all over the country. They are really rooted in bringing together the descendants of enslaved and the descendants of enslavers specifically, but not necessarily people who have a genetic tie to each other. It's really people who are interested in doing this work. If they're able to find the descendants of enslaved and enslavers who may be biologically related or related through economics and that economic history, that's wonderful. And they have healing circles and they do a lot of great work. They also are doing a lot of work in reparations right now and really just in healing. So they have healing circles for anybody who wants to work through the process of understanding, especially for European Americans, understanding the roles their ancestors had in the slave economy, either as an enslaver or maybe they owned a textile mill. And so they were getting cotton up to Massachusetts, and that cotton was coming that had been picked by enslaved people, or maybe they had dye and that indigo was picked by enslaved people, right? So sometimes people weren't directly enslavers, but they and their profession still benefited from the economy of enslavement. If you have people in your family tree who you've been able to identify as enslavers or slaveholders, this website, Beyond Kin Project, has some really great tools for how you can actually put them in your public ancestry tree. You can identify the slaveholders, SH. You can start putting in the enslaved people, even if they're not genetically tied to you. If you know those names, if you have a will, if you have property records, deeds, anything with those names, again, for a lot of the descendants of enslaved people, we don't often have anything. So to have those names, or we have a name, but we don't know what to do with it, being able to search on Ancestry and those people start to come up in other people's trees, the same way a lot of us keep benefiting from the crowdsourced, I want to say this though, well crowdsourced, because we all know there's some really poorly done trees on Ancestry. So well crowdsourced trees on Ancestry. just know that this could be a really great way to help people. If you're really into making a difference in some of these ways, and again, these are focusing really on enslaver enslaved. I don't have as many examples for Native reparations. I haven't personally done as much work in there, so I don't want to speak directly from that place because I don't want to misquote, but there is some reparations work being done in those fields too. So keep that in mind if you know you had an ancestor who was a homesteader, for example. I would say try and find out what some of the tribes were who were on that land, figure out what happened with some of those treaties, figure out where some of those tribes were forcibly relocated, and see if there's any reparations work being done or any pay it forwards or donations you can do in those ways too, to give back to those communities who were taken from their land that then your ancestors may have benefited from getting to settle on. There's also some great Facebook groups. If anybody's not a member of this one and you're into this sort of work, this Facebook group is amazing. Amazing work is happening in here every day. Sometimes people just find a will in their family books. They just take a picture of it and put it right in this group. And I've seen examples where somebody posts that, they make some comments, and somebody who descends from those enslaved people has been able to find their family because somebody just posted that picture in this Facebook group. It's really, really amazing. Another way to help, and this goes into a bigger picture, is indexing. Indexing, transcribing, Family Search is doing it, Smithsonian is doing it, tons of people. Missouri, the Missouri State Archives is doing it, the state of Missouri. They're doing different transcription projects. A lot of this is crowdsourced. A lot of us have benefited from volunteers, right? When the 1950 census came out, volunteers came together to really crowdsource all of that information so we could get on and find our ancestors. Again, a lot of the focus originally really was on these more Eurocentric records. There are projects out there, though, that focus on women's records, records for traditionally underrepresented populations. And most people say, I'm going to go do some crowdsourcing for the families that I'm already associated with. I'm from Virginia, so I'm going to go do Virginia records. Maybe consider, rather than looking at records that could benefit you personally, when maybe you've already benefited from so much work others have done, consider looking for transcription projects that could benefit somebody else as a way to pay it forward, a group that doesn't have as much record availability, and getting these records digitized, transcribed, could really move their family close to even where yours might already be. So there's tons of indexing projects. Even if you choose not to do something in America, consider a part of the world that maybe isn't Western Europe, right? If you have languages besides English that you know, and maybe have some faculty in that language, sometimes other records are already in English, so you don't need to have that language skill, but just consider how you could pay that work forward in a way that would benefit other people, because especially for European Americans who are doing their genealogy, I'll say we/they, because my mom is white, have already benefited so much from the work that others did in front of us. So the reason I give talks like this and the work that I do is really in honor of those whose stories haven't yet been written or they've been lost to time, and we really need to uncover them so everybody can get their history back. Being a genealogist, I would be remiss not to put our GPS at the end of my presentation. And I really think this feeds right into this work of anti-racist genealogy, right? Conducting reasonably exhaustive research means we're not just looking for Henry Bowman in the 1860 regular census. It means we are seeing and analyzing thoroughly, and we're seeing everything says he probably was an enslaver. We need to find not just a slave schedule. We need to see, can we find deeds? Can we find property records? Can we find wills? What else can we find to learn about if he's our ancestor, Henry Bowman, and learn all of those things, not just the feel-good stories, not just that he had a beautiful big plantation house, but really learning that full history. Again, we want to resolve our conflicts. If those conflicts are from written records, if those conflicts are from an oral history and oral tradition, either way, we want to resolve those conflicts and try and find a little bit more concrete evidence to make sure we are on the right trail and we're not putting a whole new branch of people in our family tree, like those family trees on Ancestry that are so bad. Don't use those. So make sure you have everything sourced. Always make sure that you Cite your sources. I think this is my least favorite part of genealogy, if I have to be honest. It's not fun to cite your sources. It's not fun to use Chicago Manual of Style. But even if that's not your thing and you're just doing this as a hobby, think about all the times that you go back to a record later and you're like, why did I put this in my tree? Or why did I think their birth date was 1852? Where did I get that information? Slowing down, taking the time to cite those sources, even if it's a nice research log journal. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything fancy. It doesn't have to be Chicago Manual of Style if you're not writing research reports for clients, for example. But make sure you cite those sources as well. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I am excited for any questions any of you may have.
All righty. Thank you so much, Micah, for that presentation. That was so engaging and informative and just so many wonderful things for us to think about. I've never heard of genealogy presented in quite this way before. So it's been really
Oh,
fascinating. Thank you.
yeah,
Okay, so
absolutely.
the first thing I'm going to do is stop our recording.